The office was unusually quiet for a Tuesday night. Rows of empty desks stretched into the dimly lit corners of the floor. Blake, seated upright, adjusted his glasses and clicked through slides on his laptop with a practiced precision. Across from him, Sean leaned back in his chair, one foot resting casually on the edge of the table. He twirled a pen between his fingers, his carefree posture in sharp contrast to Blake's rigid demeanor. They weren't alone by accident. The project, a critical presentation for their company's most demanding client, had brought them here. At least that's the official reason. Tonight wasn't just about spreadsheets and deadlines. It was about the rare chance to exist in the same space, uninterrupted. Blake cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We need to rethink the financial projection slide. It's too optimistic. Sean smirked, his gaze fixed on Blake. You think I haven't been rethinking it all day? We'll be fine. Relax. Blake's fingers paused over his keyboard. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing. We don't get to relax. Not with this client. Not with what's at stake. Sean's smirk faded. He leaned forward, placing the pen down. You mean the deal? Or everything else we've got on the line? Blake didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the screen, his voice softening. Both. The clock on the wall ticked, counting down to their early morning deadline. The stakes weren't just professional, they were personal. Failure wasn't an option. Neither was being found out. Sean stretched, letting his chair creak loudly, and leaned over to point at Blake's screen. That slide looks good enough. You don't need to stress over every tiny detail. Blake's jaw tightened as he kept his eyes on the monitor. Good enough isn't going to cut it, Sean. We can't afford to be sloppy with this client. Sean shrugged, leaning back again. It's not sloppy, it's efficient. You spend too much time fussing, and we'll miss the bigger picture. A flicker of tension passed between them, subtle but unmistakable. Blake sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Maybe if you put as much effort into this presentation as you do into cracking jokes, we'd actually make some progress. Sean's grin vanished, his voice sharpening. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were the only one working here. Should I start asking your permission before I breathe? Blake turned to face him, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. This isn't about me wanting control. It's about doing the job properly. Sean stood, tossing the printouts onto the table. And it's always about you being perfect, isn't it? Maybe you should let go for once and trust someone else. The room fell into silence, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Blake's expression softened, his shoulders sinking slightly. You think I don't trust you? That's not it. Sean crossed his arms, his tone quieter now. Then what is it? Because sometimes it feels like you're more worried about what happens if someone sees us than anything else. The words hung in the air, more cutting than either had intended. Blake looked away, his hands still on the keyboard. You don't get it, he muttered, almost to himself. I can't afford to lose this job, and I can't afford to lose you either. Sean exhaled, his stance loosening. He stepped closer but kept his voice steady. I never asked you to choose, but you don't have to carry all this alone, Blake. You've got me, whether we're in this office or not. The moment lingered, fragile but grounding. Blake didn't reply, but his fingers stopped moving. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to pause, glancing up to meet Sean's eyes. Sean stood near the window, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze focused on the city lights below. Blake remained at the table, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the edge of his laptop. Sean broke the quiet first. Look, I'm sorry, he said, his voice softer than before. I know I joke around too much, but It's not because I don't care. I do. More than you probably realize. Blake turned, his expression guarded but not unkind. Sean continued, his eyes still on the window. It gets to me sometimes. Pretending we're nothing more than coworkers. Not being able to say what I feel or, hell, even just hold your hand without looking over my shoulder. He shook his head. It's exhausting. Blake let out a long breath, closing his laptop. You think I don't feel the same? He hesitated, then spoke more quietly. I'm scared, Sean. If anyone finds out, it's not just us on the line. It's our jobs, our reputations, and then there's this constant voice in my head asking, what if I lose you too? Sean turned to face him, his expression softening. You won't. I'm not going anywhere. He moved closer, pulling out the chair across from Blake and sitting down. But I can't do this alone. We've got to figure this out together. He looked at him for a long moment, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. I want that too, he admitted. But how? In this place, in this world, it feels impossible. Sean leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Maybe not forever. Maybe someday we won't have to think twice about it. Blake's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, one Sean hadn't seen all night. For a moment, neither spoke. Sean reached out tentatively, letting his hand brush against Blake's. Blake didn't pull away. Slowly, their fingers intertwined, a quiet affirmation of everything they couldn't put into words. Sean tilted his head, his smile now a little playful. You know, if we don't finish this presentation, we're going to have bigger problems than hiding us. Blake chuckled softly, the tension easing. Let's get it done then. But neither let go of the other's hand right away. The calm they'd found was shattered in an instant. Blake's laptop emitted a sharp beep, and an error message filled the screen. His heart dropped as he stared at the words, "File corrupted. Unable to open. No, no, no." Blake muttered, frantically clicking through folders, but the presentation file was frozen, its contents inaccessible. Sean, sensing the shift, leaned over. What happened? The file. It's gone, Blake said, his voice tight. I don't know how, but it's gone. Sean was already moving, pulling his chair closer to Blake's. Okay. Let's not panic. Do you have a backup? Blake shook his head, cursing under his breath. I didn't save one. I was updating it directly. Sean's eyes darted to his own laptop. Wait, didn't you send me an earlier version earlier today? Check your email. Blake's hands trembled as he opened his inbox. Relief flickered across his face when he found Sean's message, but it was short-lived. It's from this morning. We've made so many changes since then. Doesn't matter, Sean said quickly. It's better than starting from scratch. Send it to me and I'll rebuild what we lost while you focus on the data charts. Blake hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Sean's voice broke through his thoughts. Hey, trust me, we've got this. The next few minutes were a flurry of keystrokes and hurried conversation. Blake recompiled the missing data while Sean meticulously recreated the slides. Every so often, Sean glanced at Blake, a steadying presence in the chaos. Don't forget the projection graph, Blake said without looking up. Already on it, Sean replied, his tone calm but focused. And check your numbers on the Q3 growth. They looked off earlier. Blake double-checked, his lips twitching into the faintest smile. They were off. Thanks. For the first time that night, Blake felt the weight of the situation ease. Not because the crisis was over, but because Sean was there, fully present and unshakable. When the last slide finally came together, Blake leaned back in his chair, letting out a long exhale. Sean leaned back as well, spinning slightly in his chair before turning to face Blake. "See? Told you we'd pull through," Sean said, his grin playful but warm. Blake met his gaze, something shifting in his expression. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Sean's smile softened. "You never have to. That's the point." For Blake, it wasn't just about the presentation anymore. It was about Sean, about the way he showed up steady and dependable, even in the middle of a crisis. And for Sean, it wasn't just about the work. It was about Blake, his quiet strength, his unwavering determination, and the care he poured into everything, including the relationship they were fighting to protect. The final slide loaded perfectly, and Blake's shoulders relaxed for the first time that night. The clock read 4:15 a.m., with just enough time to spare before morning. Sean leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "You know, we're kind of brilliant. Saved the client, saved the company. Maybe we should treat ourselves to a medal or something." Blake chuckled softly, closing his laptop. "A medal sounds nice. Or maybe just sleep for once." Sean grinned, his eyes lingering on Blake a moment too long. "You know, for someone who's so hard on himself, you're pretty amazing when you stop to breathe." Without thinking, Blake stood, taking a step closer to Sean. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You make everything seem easier, even when it's not." Sean tilted his head, caught off guard by the shift in Blake's tone. Before he could reply, Blake leaned in, pressing his lips against Sean's, in a kiss that was soft at first but quickly deepened with unspoken intensity. Sean froze for a second, surprised, but then he kissed back, his hand moving to Blake's waist as if to steady him. The moment stretched on. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths were uneven, their foreheads almost touching. Sean's voice was quiet but firm. "If we keep hiding, we'll lose ourselves in the process. I'm done pretending, Blake." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but his eyes flicked upward to the corner of the room. His stomach dropped. The security camera. Sean followed his gaze, his hand still resting on Blake's hip. The small red light on the device blinked, its presence suddenly impossible to ignore. "Do you think—" Sean started, his voice trailing off. Blake stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he said, his words rushed. "Maybe it's off at night. Maybe it's not recording." They exchanged a look, equal parts hope and dread. Sean shrugged, though the unease in his eyes betrayed his calm tone. "Guess we'll find out tomorrow." The morning came faster than either of them expected. Their presentation had gone flawlessly. The client's enthusiastic reaction still rang in Blake's ears. A string of praises, promises of continued partnership, and even a mention of recommending their team to other departments. The energy in the room shifted as the reality of the night caught up with them. The presentation was done, their jobs were safe, but the other questions, the ones they hadn't fully faced yet, lingered. Sean's voice softened. "About last night. The camera, the kiss, everything. Where do we go from here?" Blake hesitated. "We figure it out. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I'm tired of living in fear. If we keep waiting for the perfect time, we'll never have it." Sean muttered, "You sure you're ready for that?" Blake nodded. "I'm sure of you. That's enough." As they packed their bags and prepared to leave, Sean glanced back at the blinking security camera. "Think we'll get a chance to see if it caught anything?" Blake smirked, surprising even himself. "One problem at a time. For now, let's just go get breakfast." Sean laughed, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "You're finally learning to relax. I like this side of you." Sean straightened, slipping the note under Blake's keyboard before slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Ready to head out?" Blake nodded. As they walked toward the elevator, the weight of secrecy seemed lighter, replaced by something closer to possibility. The doors closed behind them, and the office was left still once again. Back at Blake's desk, the note waited patiently. It read simply, "Whatever happens, I'm with you. Always. Don't be in a rush to leave if you find this story interesting and relatable. Kindly like, share to others, and subscribe to get daily tales of gay love life. We are Pride Stories Unfiltered, your #1 pride."